All right, let's get started. Mr. Graham, would you please take your seat? Mr. Graham, would you please take your seat? You're leaving. Is my brother in the room? Oh, he's over there. Okay, good. I want to get some things straight before we start this afternoon. First of all, I want to make it clear that I told him no swearing. So that's one rule he broke. I also told him no data, and he did sneak in some data, right? No data, I told him. So that's a problem. So tonight, he will be in the basement. And I have a lock on the basement door, too. There's only one problem. My wine cellar's in the basement. And I don't have a lock for that door, so there's going to be a problem. Okay, let's go ahead and play the video.
And McDavid scores!
You know the difference between hockey and those other sports? You gotta be tough to be a hockey player.
You would not take your cell phone and repeatedly throw it against the wall or on the ground and then expect it to work. Yet that's exactly what we're doing to brains of hockey players.
When it comes to treating or dealing with concussions.
People were passing it off as, oh, it's just a ding, it's just a bell ringer, you know, suck it up, macho, get back into play. You know, that attitude has really held things back. But now we know that, you know, cases like Rowan, Stringer have brought home the point that concussion and the consequences of concussion are a significant public health issue.
It's not meaning it's not to prevent concussions. Concussions are going to happen. It's just a reality. You cannot prevent concussions from ever happening again. But it's prevention of the catastrophic events that can happen.
The responsibility lies with the school boards, the athletic organizations, and parents, and of course the athletes. And the key element is to educate the children, or the athletes rather, and the organizations around the athlete as to the seriousness of brain injuries, or any sort of event that can create a brain injury.
I wasn't the same player after I got hit a few times and knocked out. I wasn't close, and although I still love the game and I could get by and contribute here and there, it wears on you that you don't, or you can't play to the same level that you once could.
I told them to take Blaine's clip out of there, but they left it in. Next time. From an educational perspective, there's no doubt that sustaining a concussion can have significant consequences on student learning. It is important that we continue to make strides in raising awareness in our school systems to help ensure we all understand head injuries, concussions, and their potential impact on students. As you can see from the video, we've come a long way from the old attitudes about concussions to today's focus on safety and prevention. I would like to welcome members of the Rowan's Law Advisory Committee who form our panel today. We're here to provide information and to help answer some questions about the committee's mandate, the final report and recommendations submitted to the Ontario government, and to explain how the legislation will impact school boards. It was my distinct privilege to serve on the Rowan's Law Advisory Committee on behalf of CODE, the Council of Directors of Education, and I'm proud of the work that was accomplished. I believe the report and recommended actions will go a long way towards protecting students who participate in school sport and physical education classes from potentially serious, long-term, harmful effects of concussion. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panel this afternoon. Gordon Stringer is the father of Rowan Stringer, who tragically lost her life in May 2013 after suffering 3 concussions in less than a week. While playing high school rugby, Rowan was 17 years old. After her death, Gordon and his family dedicated themselves to sharing Rowan's story and educating children, athletes, and all involved in sports. Their goal is to help prevent future injuries and death from concussion. I'd like to thank Gordon for his courage in standing up to tell Rowan's story and for being with us today. You're an inspiration to us all. Paul Hunter is Rugby Canada's Manager of National Coach Development, having previously served as a Rugby Development Officer with Scottish Rugby. Rugby Canada's coach development targets the ongoing development of coaches, teaching coaches the leadership responsibility for youth rugby development programs. Paul is currently responsible for Rugby Canada's Play Smart initiative, the player welfare program that ensures everyone has a responsibility to create a safe environment for participants. This ranges from injury recording and tracking, drug education, child protection training, including concussion management. As a hobby, Paul is coaching the senior men's team for the Peterborough Rugby Club. We are pleased to have him with us this afternoon. And Charles Tator needs no further introduction, I'm sure. He's been a key presenter in our International Concussion Summit since its inception. We're grateful for his support over the years and tireless work he does to promote the prevention of concussions and mitigate the impact of concussions. As well, Dr. Dan Cass, who was unable to attend today, was appointed the chair of the Rowan's Law Advisory Committee and is currently the Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Executive of Sunnybrook Health Science Center. Rowan's Law Advisory Committee was tasked with important complex work and would like to thank Dan for his leadership as chair. I'd like to thank all our panelists for sharing their time and expertise with us today. First of all, I'd like to invite Gordon Stringer to come up to the podium.
Well, thank you all for being here today. This is one of the most incredibly large audiences I've had the honor to speak with, so it's quite an honor to be here. And I thank you, Warren, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak about Rowan and her story. I always feel a bit uneasy talking about, as we call it, Rowan's story. Because the fact is, her story began on June 25th, 1995. Speaking solely regarding the events around her death leaves so much of who she was and what she accomplished unsaid. However, her legacy has and will reflect her caring, nurturing, helpful, active, and loving nature. This part of her story began on Friday, May the 3rd, 2013, exactly 5 years ago today. She was participating with her school team in a rugby tournament. They had 3 games that day. In the 3rd game, she was removed from the field. We were not present at the time. Apparently, that game was the first time that she suffered a concussive event. We weren't informed of it. We didn't know what happened. She complained about a headache on Saturday. She was a kid who got headaches. It wasn't anything that was unusual, so it didn't register anything with us. She took Advil, headache went away. She seemed fine on Sunday. We had a family gathering, seemed like her regular self. On Monday, she had another game with her school. This was the first game of the year. Apparently in that game, she took a knee or a kick to the head. Again, she didn't say anything about it. Coaches never said anything about it. She did have a rather large bruise on her knee, which became the focus of attention, and that's another highlight of concussion. It's an invisible injury. So our focus was on the knee. You should look after your knee, you got to let your knee rest, and oh, come on, Dad, I've had worse than that, and et cetera, et cetera. The standard conversation you have with your kid in athletics, and yeah, I can play through this, it's no problem. On Wednesday, May the 8th, she had another game for her school. I was getting ready to leave my office when the phone rang, and the call was to inform me that Rowan was being taken unconscious by ambulance from the high school rugby field to the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. This was the beginning of what I can only describe as a 5-day-long nightmare of surgery, scans, medical staff, highly qualified medical staff. We're blessed to have the Children's Hospital in Ottawa, doing all they could to try and relieve the massive intracranial pressure that was destroying her brain. On Saturday, May 11th, the doctors met with us for, we call it that talk. That's the talk that no parent ever wants to be involved in. We decided at that point to stop any further interventions and ask that Rowan's wish to donate her organs be respected. On Sunday, May 12th, Mother's Day, she was pronounced brain dead. We said our goodbyes and watched them take her to the operating room. On Monday morning, we were woken by the first of many phone calls. The first call was from Trillium Gift of Life, and they let us know that all of her organs and tissues had been used, and this in a small way provided us with some solace. The next calls, however, were from the media. We'd been in the hospital for 5 days. We really didn't know what was going on outside of the hospital. But the school board had issued a news report that she had passed away. And so the media started calling, wanting to talk to us about Rowan and what had happened. And we had to quickly decide if we would tell her story or not, or whether we would just huddle together in our grief with family. But Kathleen and I decided quickly that to tell her story was the way we would go, in the hopes that her story wouldn't be repeated. About 15 months later, I got a call from the coroner's office in Ottawa to inform me that some guy named Dr. Charles Tator had requested that an inquest be conducted into her death. At the time, I had no idea who Dr. Charles Tator was, or how truly fortunate we were that he had an interest in Rowan's story. I Googled him, as we do. And then I contacted him, I phoned him. And after I'd Googled him, I thought, oh, this guy's, he's important, he's gonna have all kinds of things to do. And so I left a message thinking, well, he might call me back in a few days or something. Within 15 minutes, he called me back. I wanted to understand why he was interested in having an inquest into Rowan's death. And very simply, it boiled down to wanting to learn everything surrounding what happened, leading up to the fateful tackle, and to learn best how to prevent it happening again. And based on that, we were committed to having this done. The inquest took place late May 2015 through early June, some 2 years after Rowan passed away. It was emotionally draining, reliving things, but also learning aspects that we had no knowledge of previously. I've described it as like removing a scab tearing it off a wound that's not really yet healed. But at the conclusion, we received 49 very insightful recommendations from the jury to mitigate a repeat of Rowan's tragedy. However, I then learned, after being asked a poignant question from the media after the inquest ended, what's next? And I kind of thought that was an odd question, but I looked into it, and recommendations from an inquest are not binding on anybody. They could very well sit on a shelf and gather dust, and nobody's going to say anything about it. So I had to find a way to make sure that these recommendations weren't going to be ignored. So I went to Lisa MacLeod, our MPP, and with her support of many stakeholders, and engaging Catherine Fife from the NDP and John Fraser from the Liberal Party, we received all-party support for the Rowan's Law Advisory Committee Act in Ontario, which was we're calling it now the first Rowan's Law, which established the advisory committee and tasked them with providing recommendations to the government as to how best to implement the 49 recommendations. The committee released our report in September of 2017, and that led to the introduction on December 14th of Bill 193, Rowan's Law, Concussion Safety 2017. From there, we've gone through second and third reading, and in March, Rowan's Law became the first concussion legislation in Canada. However, we're not finished. The work must continue to other jurisdictions in Canada. Ontario has done the heavy lifting. We've had the expert panel. We've had the advisory on how to best to deal with these things. We've had the inquest. The work must continue to other provinces in Canada. I hope that you will be part of the champions for that change. That you'll join in supporting us to ensure that our young people receive the support and education they need to be active and to be safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gord and Kathleen, for your inspiration and helping keep this going. So I'm going to do Dr. Dan Cass, and obviously I'm not Dr. Dan Cass, but I'm going to do the presentation that he usually does as he was chair of the Rowan's Law Committee. The coroner's inquest, which Gordon talked about, held on Rowan's death, 49 recommendations were made. And they could sit on a shelf. They're not binding, and they're not often implemented. But the private members bill introduced by Lisa MacLeod, the MPP, Rowan's Law Advisory Committee Act, was introduced. The committee officially formed on September 9th, 2016. One-year mandate, report to be delivered by September 9th, 2017, and automatically repealed on December 9th, on 2017. The mandate of the committee, to review 49 recommendations made by the inquest jury, review the legislations, policies, and best practices from other jurisdictions with respect to head injuries and including concussion. Make recommendations. How to prevent, mitigate, and create awareness about head injuries in the sport in Ontario. Also make other recommendations that are advisable with respect to head injury prevention or treatment. Within 1 year of the beginning work, provide recommendations in a report to the Ministry of Tourism, Culture, and Sport. Members of the committee, Gordon Stringer, myself, Chris Markham, Executive Director of CEO of OFIA, Jennifer Knox, President of OFSA, Paul Hunter, who's here today, Manager of National Coaching Development, Rugby Canada, Susan Kitchen, Executive Director, Coaches Association of Ontario, Louise Logan, National Project Director to 2020 World Congress of Safety and Health at Work, Eric Lindros, NHL Hall of Fame inductee, Rosie McLennan, Olympic gold medalist, Trampoline Team Canada, Dr. Charles Tator, Elizabeth White, nurse practitioner, neurosurgery outreach for 6 kids, Dr. Rosanna Salvatera, medical officer of health, Peterborough Public Health, Kent Bassett Spears, CEO of Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation, Dr. Dan Cass, chair, and the vice president of medical in St. Joseph Health Center at that time, and now he's in Sunnybrook. Oh, I'm not following my clicking very well. Legislation, mandatory concussion education. This is what the legislation is saying. Athletes, parents, guardians, coaches, officials, and educators. Mandatory. Immediate removal from play. And we had some discussion on that earlier. Medical diagnosis, physician or nurse practitioner. Graduated, return to learn and return to pay, and a code of conduct. Code of conduct is going to be talked about a little bit more. Data collection and analysis, and also an annual Rowan's Law Day. Publicly reporting on the information, collection of data re suspected concussions, and continue to monitor the existing concussion policy until legislation enacted in PPM 158. Prevention, code of conduct with zero tolerance policies, mandatory expulsion. Standards and accountability, safe playing surfaces. So some questions around that. At least one person in addition to coaches with training in concussion identification and management. Annual training for all coaches in concussion identification and management. Investment in an electronic solution of data capture, sharing, and reporting. In the meantime, until we get the electronic part, we're going to make sure that we have a manual system in the interim. Special fee codes and a creation of a coach's toolkit. Awareness, concussion education, all teacher education training, and rebranding Ontario Concussion Portal under Rowan's Law. Sustained public awareness campaign, annual concussion education in schools at all levels, annual concussion awareness event, annual concussion education for all teachers and administrators, and enhanced education for health professionals. Additional actions, federal government expand focus on school-based and non-school-based amateur sport. Work with First Nation leaders and stakeholders to implement some of the similar actions, and the creation of Rowan's Law Concussion Partners Committee, maintaining the momentum. Rowan's Law received royal assent on March 7th of this year. Annual Rowan's Law Day is September 26th. Now they amend the Education Act and reissue PPM 158 school board policies in concussion. Amending the Act by providing the Minister of Education with the authority to reissue PPM 158 and for school board policies on concussion as a binding policy. So they'll reissue 158 with these recommendations in them. The update to PPM 158 is required to ensure consistency of Rowan's Law and the relevant regulations. Once revised, the PPM 158 will be reissued and will be binding policy under the Rowan's Law. The timing is to coincide with the coming of the effect of Rowan's Law and the relevant regulations. Ministry of Education, here's their next steps, and this was released maybe a week and a half ago. Evaluation of the 158 is one of the things they're going to do right away, and continued engagement in. EDU is the Ministry of Education, exploring options to include concussion awareness in the pre-service teacher evaluation. That was one of the recommendations. EDU will collaborate with MTCS on a provincial concussion awareness campaign for Rowan's Law Day on September 26, 2018. EDU, Ministry of Education, is supporting the MTCS with established fields of play standards and the coaches' toolkits. Ministry of Education will also continue to engage with school boards and education partners. Now, this is where the last time we had a presentation, we had Eric present. So, in place of Eric, not the same type of jersey, is Paul Hunter from Rugby Canada. Please welcome Paul.
Thank you very much. This might go down in history as the biggest disappointment when people expect Eric Lindros. So I thank you for the phone call. When Warren asked me yesterday, can I come down and speak at a conference, I absolutely said yes. He then followed that up with, you're going to replace Eric Lindros. So lesson learned, not to pick the phone up to Warren. So I would just start off, I cannot do anything around the accent. Hopefully we have some translators in the room that could help out. It was a challenge on the advisory committee for everyone to understand what I was saying, but we will work through that today. I just want to start off by wholeheartedly saying a thank you to Gord and Kathleen. It is an incredible journey that they are on that is making an incredible difference, and it's inspiring to have worked with them on the advisory committee and the ongoing work. Gord is always on the end of a telephone if there's ever an inquiry, so I would like to start off and just thank them for that. I'll talk a little bit about where sports' role was on the advisory committee and a little bit about how rugby has tried to implement some of the recommendations and go a little bit further. Recent research shows that the #1 deterrent to the growth in rugby is the perception of rugby. So there's a lot of questions out there about how dangerous rugby can be, and we all know that there's many benefits from participating in sport: the tackling of obesity, the teamwork, the morale, being included with your friends. There's lots of benefits, but there's also inherent risks that come with playing rugby. And we have to be really clear that there are inherent risks and not bury our head in the sand. What the recommendations now do for a sports organisation is they make them accountable. There are clear non-negotiations or non-negotiables within the Rowan's Law recommendations. So there's no room for hiding or avoiding things like codes of conduct, which would be implemented into policy. There's no room for hiding now for sports organisations to continually and ongoing education of their coaches and going above and beyond that, administrators, referees and therapists. So these non-negotiables will hold sports more accountable to what they should be doing. The important thing that we have to know from a sports point of view is we have a duty of care to protect our participants, whether that's young children or adolescents. We should be taking everything within our power to ensure that while they're within our care, that we're creating the safest environment possible for kids to be physically active and participate in sport. Everyone has a responsibility to be able to identify and detect signs and symptoms of concussion. And that's how we're looking at that ongoing education piece. And Dr. Tator has spoke throughout this morning about being able to recognize and remove. And if in doubt, sit the player out. Really simple messages that if you're involved in sport, through ongoing education, we should be able to identify signs and symptoms of concussion and remove that athlete from the field, from the rink, from the court, or from the pool immediately. And then we would follow gradual return to play and gradual return to learn protocols. Sports also have a responsibility for prevention, to try and minimize risks of potential concussion. I'll share a couple of examples in rugby of what we're trying to do to minimize the potential risk of concussion. And some of the things that we are doing are taken from other sports, and there's some fantastic work being done by other sports. But by having a zero tolerance approach to no contact to the head is one of the things that rugby does. This isn't a new rule, and we know from Rowan's case that a dangerous tackle was related to the second impact syndrome. So we know that there's ongoing education that needs to happen around laws, around player welfare. It's not just a one-stop shop, but it's continually educating our referees and our match officials, our touch judges, on what are the number one priorities around player welfare before we start getting into the X's and O's. So having webinars, ongoing resources through social media to educate our referees being assessed ongoing more often, that they are competent and confident to manage a sport was one area of prevention. The other piece in rugby through research is we were able to identify where the highest number of concussions were happening, which was in the tackle. So we found out through research that if you can lower the height of contact, then you can reduce the likelihood of a concussion. And what we've now done, some of our changes to our laws, is that there's now tackling when we introduce the tackle in rugby that it happens below the waist. So that's using evidence to identify that here is where we're seeing a spike in the increased number of concussions, and making a law amendment that tackling must be below the waist when we introduce tackling. Creating resources to support coaches on how to tackle, also trying to support players on correct tackle technique. These are some of the responsibilities that sports have to look at your game and identify which areas of the game have high risk. And where we're able to identify areas of the game that have high risk, what can we then do and what can we then put in place to support the people that are either coaching, that are either playing, or the people that are actually refereeing these games. Also, how we manage concussions. So if we identify that somebody has a potential concussion, what are we doing? Educating our coaches, our players, administrators on the gradual return to play protocols, and also making them aware that they need to be familiar with the gradual return to learn. And we don't just sit in isolation, that we only work in our own sport. We understand that our kids and our adolescents play multiple sports. So that means that we have to communicate with each other. And if somebody does have an injury in one sport, that schools are notified, parents are notified, and given a resource point of where they can go and ask for more information. And we spoke about Parachute Canada, Coaching Association of Canada as well, providing valuable resources for coaches, for parents, players, and administrators as well, that if we suspect or we're not sure, there is somewhere that we can reach out to and find that answer. Parents are asking questions, and they should ask questions when their kid goes into a sport. So coaches and sports now need to be able to respond to those questions. What do you do if there's a concussion? What are you doing to minimize that concussion? what education is going on. So as a national sporting organisation, we need to work with our provincial unions, our coaches, our clubs, our schools to ensure that we can answer these questions. Not only answer them, but implement strategies to ensure that they're effective as well. Parents need to know that their kids are in safe hands and that we're doing everything that we possibly can to minimise the risk of concussion. And if we do identify a sign or symptom of concussion, that the person is removed immediately, and we seek the necessary medical assessment, and then we follow our gradual return to play and gradual return to learn protocols. Another piece, some interesting discussion this morning around whose responsibility. I would stress, and I couldn't stress this enough, that we all have a responsibility to manage concussion and player welfare. Something that we implemented or started with in Rugby Canada is we asked our board and our senior management and administrators to educate themselves through concussion management. So they all have to complete concussion management. The reason for that is they need to be fully aware that if we do have coaches that are not adhering to our policies, if we do go to them and say that we have a concern, that they understand the severity of the discussion that we're having. So we had some discussions this morning of what the coach's responsibility is. Administration has a huge responsibility in ensuring that the people that they have in place to coach, whether that be a board of a club or whether that be a coach coming into a school, that we're following the necessary protocols and doing our due diligence to ensure that that coach will remove somebody if they suspect a concussion. The biggest challenge, or the last thing I would leave, is I would encourage us to have some dialogue here. There's some fantastic experience and knowledge on this stage. We have to change a culture, and that's a huge challenge for us. I think we have to change that culture through education. I think that's a big part of where we start, but we all have a responsibility. Every single person in this room is passionate about sport. Everyone here is passionate to make sure that our kids and adolescents are physically active. We know the benefits of sport, but we have to ensure that what we're doing is creating the safest environment possible. And the last piece I would leave us with is, talking about concussion doesn't mean that we don't play sports. It means that these sports have to create the safest environment possible. So I thank you and welcome some questions soon.
Before I thank Paul, I want to know, by show of hands, how many understood anything he said? Fabulous. I'm telling you, phone one day ahead and come and speak here is an outstanding, and I want to thank you from the whole panel and from everybody here, Paul, for filling in. You did a fantastic job. Outstanding. Thank you. Okay, and now I'd like to ask Dr. Tator to come up and say a few words about his experiences with the Rowan's Law Advisory Committee, which pretty much in the inception, he started the whole thing, and some of the really important aspects of the recommendations that he would like to see implemented as soon as possible. Charles?
In fact, their approach to this has really been nothing short of heroic. And so it really has been a pleasure to get to know both of you and to be here today to talk about what has been accomplished, because I think it really is a major accomplishment that we have been able to pull this off. I would like to acknowledge other people who played a significant role along the way. So we have to think of Dr. Louise McNaughton-Filion, who's the regional coroner for Ottawa, who took my calls and was patient with me and was very open to the idea that this required an inquest to make it clear why Rowan died and to make sure nobody else does die from a preventable injury. Other people who played a major role were in the ministries of education and health as well. That this was a tri-ministerial approach. The sport ministry took the major role, but there was still significant input from both education and health. And certainly the Ministry of Education laid the seeds for this with their PPM 158, which I think also is a pat on the back to Ontario for being the first province to have a province-wide policy and procedure memorandum related to concussion, putting the onus on the district school boards to carry it out. This policy, I think, is extremely important, but unfortunately, it only applies to the public schools, both Catholic boards and regular boards, but it doesn't apply to universities, and it doesn't apply to private schools, and it doesn't apply to all of the sporting activities that go on outside the school. So that's why we had to go beyond PPM 158 and go to legislation. And all the while, we were witnessing what was going on in the US, and I believe that the evidence is now beginning to mount, because it was only since 2014 when all 50 states accomplished concussion legislation. It takes a while for the research to be done to prove that this is a good thing. And we really do need to follow that through. So once legislation is in place, we can't stop there. We have to show that this was a valuable move, and there are ways of evaluating an injury prevention project like Rowan's Law. The Ministry of Education has continued to play a role, I'm happy to say. They're actually funding a project that we're doing in our concussion center to evaluate PPM 158. And in fact, are there any principals in the audience? Oh, good. Because our questionnaire, there's about 60 questions on that questionnaire that will be sent almost as we speak to 1,000 principals in Ontario's public schools to evaluate PPM 158. And as you heard from Warren, there will be an update of that so that there's a harmonization between Rowan's Law and PPM 158. So that's really wonderful to hear. This week, we were at a meeting at the Health Ministry. Gordon was there, encouraging the Deputy Minister to get on with it. Our last advice to him was do it. So they have a role to play. For example, making sure that there is a province-wide access to the people who are going to come forward to request care for concussions. And I mentioned earlier the 3 stages are the first encounter, let's say in the emergency department or doctor's office, and the second being an encounter during the return to learn and return to play process to make sure that there's follow-up. And then the third is for those who don't get better readily, And I mentioned this morning that that is about 25%. So that aspect of care also has to be considered. And the recommendation that we made was for organized concussion care clinics, multidisciplinary clinics. So we have physiotherapists, occupational therapists, neuropsychology, access, etc., because it does require a fairly large team to make sure that those people are going to get the best care so that they will have the best chance of recovering from concussion. Personally, my interest in sports injuries stems from my youth when I was a very avid athlete. I could skate to school, in fact, in public school, and the caretaker was in charge of flooding our rink at West Prep School, just north of Eglinton in Toronto. And it was an amazing experience to be able to play hockey almost every day of the winter, and then to be on my high school hockey team was a great privilege. I didn't bother you with my team picture, but I am there. And I was also very fortunate in my youth to live next door to the head photographer of the Toronto Maple Leafs, and often was his bulb boy. I'm not sure any of you know what a bulb boy is, but I carried the satchel of bulbs because in those days you only got one shot from each bulb, and so I had a satchel of bulbs because he would be snapping at rinkside, and I was right beside him at rinkside. So I saw all the greats playing at Maple Leaf Gardens, so that was a privilege. And I think the next aspect of my own encounter with catastrophic sports injuries was when I was first went into practice and encountered youngsters who had suffered catastrophic injuries. And as a brain surgeon and a spinal surgeon, that's what we deal with. And to see rugby players paralyzed from the neck down because of the collapse of the scrum. That was the chief cause of broken necks in rugby. And when this became apparent worldwide that this was something that had to be dealt with, rugby instituted rules against the collapse of the scrum. That was not part of the game. And just as Ken Dryden said this morning, we can change the games to deal with these issues and prevent injuries. So that was a great example. And another great example from my early years as a neurosurgeon was with hockey players who also broke their necks or their backs playing hockey, a sport that I participated in. And I never saw a catastrophic injury when I played hockey, but here I was as a surgeon having to deal with people with these catastrophic injuries of the brain or spinal cord. And I learned very quickly that we have not learned to put the pieces back together again, which means the emphasis has to be on prevention. Prevention is the only cure. And in my view, instituting a rule against checking from behind made a huge difference. And when we went to Hockey Canada and said, look, all these hockey players are breaking their necks when they are struck from behind and catapulted horizontally into the boards head first, and the poor little bones in the neck can't stand that force and caused damage. So Hockey Canada took this to heart and instituted a specific rule against checking from behind. That has to be eliminated from the game. And it should be dealt with harshly, and it was, and it is. And so the game has survived. And now we are faced with this issue of how to prevent head injuries in all sports, not just hockey. And we can do it. It can be done. There are many examples of where rule changes and education have made a difference. Early on in the concussion field, we did a research project on the value of sitting and watching a video that we made called Smart Hockey. And we had half the kids watch the video and another half didn't. And then we measured what happened afterwards. What were the effects of that video? And one very clear effect was that the kids who watched the video got far fewer penalties for the infractions that we wanted to emphasize: elbowing, hitting from behind. So we know that educational efforts like that can work. The other group that has been talked about in terms of Rowan's Law are the jury people, the people who sat there for about 2 weeks in Ottawa listening to all of the evidence, sifting through it. There were 5 people on the jury, and they really got it right. They really did. They came up with 49 recommendations, all of which are capable of making a significant impact on prevention of concussions. I'm especially pleased that they endorsed the idea of pre-season meetings. I think that is really essential, and I hope that that reaches the regulation stage. Eileen Silver is in the audience from the Ministry of Education, so that's a very pointed, from the Ministry of Sport now. You were in education, right? So let's try to get that as part of the regulations. Pre-season meetings where everybody learns about concussion, everybody's on the same page, the coaches, the players, and the parents. Another important aspect is the code of conduct. I don't think we tell kids exactly what's expected of them. We went through this when we did an injury prevention program at Think First and then at Parachute on skiing injuries. And what was called the Alpine Responsibility Code was built into the educational efforts for skiers. So we can do the same thing for all sports. At the beginning of the season, every player learns what's expected of them. You know, obvious things to us, like don't hit somebody into the boards from behind, should be in that code. So those measures are really significant that have been put on the table, and now we all have a job to do to make sure that they get put into action. Another job that we have to do that has grown out of the Rowan's Law in Ontario is to put legs on this so that it goes across the country. I think a countrywide Rowan's Law is Gordon and Kathleen's legacy. And we are here to make it happen. So thank you for asking me to be part of this panel, Warren.
Thank you, Dr. Tator. Just reminds me of one thing when reading Ken Dryden's book. One of the other things that he says in his book, if you've already read it, he talks about Privet is a company that is looking at an electronic means to share information. At the and they'll talk a little bit about permission of athletes, permission of parents, how you can put injuries into an electronic piece and then share with maybe the medical, other coaches in the community and those kinds of things. So they're going to make a little presentation.
It's a great question. I can speak on behalf of rugby. Rugby is governed by a world governing agency, World Rugby, which is one of the funding partners for the Berlin Convention 2016. So the research that rugby uses, one of the things we don't have in Canada in rugby is Canadian research. We unfortunately have to rely on research in other countries. So positive is we're able to share some of that research from other countries. But if you take the zero tolerance approach to contact towards the head, the world governing body had a world campaign for that. World Rugby's created resources for recognise and remove. We know that young athletes are very interactive with social media, so they got high profile athletes to share their stories, to attack the myth that it's a sign of weakness to take yourself out of a game. So our world governing body has created resources and has made global changes. To speak on rugby, Rugby Canada has the jurisdiction to make law variations to the sport in Canada. And then we can also have variations of the game from a global level as well. So there most certainly is consultation and collaboration happening there, and we're starting to see a lot more bad action happening. And from my discussion with colleagues in other sports, they are seeing a cross-pollination and a harmonization of resources and messages that are coming out from all levels of the game.
Sorry, my second one too.
I just want to add to that, and I was at the Berlin Consensus Summit also, and one of the things that I want you to realize is that there was a lot of Canadian research, and Dr. Tator can attest to that, that a lot of Canadian research on concussion and especially around girls and young and youth, and they spoke about it a lot at the Berlin, and that the kind of research that's going on in Canada really important. Go ahead.
And actually, sorry, my second one was to you, Warren. One of those 49 recommendations was annual training, and part of the PPM 158. Is that going to trickle down into the school system? I know here at DSBN we already have like a concussion designate, and would that training happen yearly, etc.?
Yes, it has to. Once the PPM changes to make it binding, that's going to be really, really important. And, you know, I also see these kinds of things. We started a number of years ago training for coaches and teachers and secretary and, you know, all of our staff. And so we started a while ago, but once it becomes legislation that we have to do it, you know, it's going to make it more important that we have to do it. But I think, you know, it's just the fact that I think it's going to change a culture, and we've all talked about this today. It's going to change a culture in what we want, what you want as a coach. You want to be trained in that, and teachers and secretaries are really important. Principals are really important because, I mean, in elementary school also that you see a lot of injuries, and Eric Lindros talked about that last time, that this is not just about sport. It's about the playground and just keeping our kids safe. So, yes, that'll be really important, and we'll be implementing that as very soon. Well, this year we will do that.
Dave Chamberlain, Limestone District School Board. I'm completely supporting everything that we're doing with Rowan's Law, and I agree we're going to have buy-in with teachers, coaches, students. That's fine. My concern is the requirement of the parents. I already know that I'm having issues with some parents when I suspect that there might be a problem with their child, a refusal to get them checked out by a doctor. So if there's a requirement that they be trained in concussion, what do we do if they refuse? Do we say the student can't play, and are we going to be thereby have the ability to fight that parent when they say, no, you're going to make them play anyway? So that's, I guess, more of a director of education question than a coach question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you'll be able to point to the legislation. Say, no, they're not going to be back playing. You'll have that authority to do that. Because if you don't, you won't be able to make a change. I think that is crucial to it. And it has to be supported. And as you say, it has to be supported by everybody, up to the director of education, whoever that is. I'll give Blaine the number to Blaine. You know how he is. But yes, it is. That's crucial. You're right. And it's not all parents, of course. We understand that it's not all parents, but you will get pushback.
Hi, Darcy McCardle, also from the DSBN, and I know, I'm a community coach as well as a high school coach, and you know, when we talk amongst coaches and we talk about what's happening with Rowan's Law, there's a lot of great awareness conversation and prevention, but I guess the concern that
it's in there, and the communication part, and that's what Privet does. That's one of the things that the software piece.
I've looked at it from the perspective of anti-smoking, anti-bullying, recycling. We never used to recycle a lot of stuff, and suddenly they started learning about it in school, and my kids were coming home and saying, yeah, Dad, don't put that in the garbage, that goes over here. If you teach kids very young how important their brain is and how important it is to look after it, that's going to
all of the research started to get involved when I was with the Ministry of Education in 2013, and I met Dr. Charles Tator. At the time, Dr. Tator came to me as a leader of one of the branches in the ministry and talked to me about the necessity of getting on with concussion education in the ministry. So thank you to Dr. Tator, but also thank you because this is an amazing collaborative effort, really fairly unprecedented in government, where we've seen a collaboration between all of the sectors, the sport, the education, the municipalities, and certainly all of the ministries, Gord and Kathleen, and all of the three parties. I'm going to talk a little bit about Rowan's Law today, and when Rowan's Law was tabled in the legislature, the final vote was 91-0 in favor of passage of Rowan's Law, which is an amazing feat. Really, so my few remarks today really are going to focus on the legislation, really what is in the legislation and where we're going with some of the regulations that have been mentioned already. So there were 21 recommendations made by the Rowan's Law Advisory Committee. Only some of those recommendations related to legislation. And the government picked up on most of the recommendations that related to what should be in the law. There are really four main items that are in the law. One is annual review of concussion resources before an athlete can register into a sport. That is for all competitive sports. That is how the legislation is written. Athletes must review annual concussion awareness resources, as well as parents or guardians of athletes who are under the age of 18, as well as teachers, school administrators, which is already there under PPM 158, as has been mentioned, as well as coaches. There is provision in the law to allow, by regulation, others, so that we have the ability, through regulations, for examples, to require officials to take this annual review of resources as well, and that's something that we're looking into. So that's number one, a really key element of Rowan's Law. Number two, it requires sport organizations and schools to establish a removal from sport protocol. As soon as a concussion is suspected, that the athlete be removed. That would apply both within schools and within the competitive amateur sports sector. The government will be providing minimum standards for those protocols, and they will be defined in regulation. Number 3, the establishment of return to sport and for education, return to learn protocols. Once again, each sport organization must have a return to sport protocol. And again, the government will identify the minimum requirements for that return to sport, return to learn protocol in regulations and through the updated PPM 158. Number 4, and we've talked a little bit about the concussion code of conduct. There, in sport organizations, most sport organizations, certainly the education sector, have codes of conduct, but what we're talking about is that sport organizations and schools establish, and it could be a part of a regular code of conduct, but a specific code of conduct that identifies zero tolerance provisions, that is reviewed with the athletes, with the parents of the athletes, with coaches on an annual basis to ensure that they all are familiar with their responsibilities. So 4 key elements of Rowan's Law. Rowan's Law also proclaims the last Wednesday in September, and we just talked and we heard from Gordon about Rowan's Law. This year, Rowan's Law will take place on September 26th. Thereafter, it will be the last Wednesday in September. And I want to point out that that provision of the Act is the only provision of the Act that has already been proclaimed and is in effect. All of the rest of these provisions, and the ones that I've just mentioned, will come into effect once the regulations are established. There's also a really important provision in the Act from our standpoint, and that's an annual reporting requirement by our Minister of Tourism, Culture and Sport to report annually to the public on progress the government is making by way of implementation of all of those 21 recommendations in the Rowan's Law report. At the same time, and the last provision is the one that we discussed, and that is the amendment to the Education Act, where PPM 158 will be updated and given elevated status. So, just talking about quickly about regulations. The way in which Rowan's Law was established and those elements of Rowan's Law really is large framework. And what we need to do in the regulations, and what we've done already, is created a consultation paper and a series of questions in a questionnaire that ask questions about what could be in the regulation. So, for example, what should be the minimum requirements of a concussion awareness material? What are the minimum requirements for a concussion code of conduct protocol? We also have a number of other questions that relate generally to Rowan's Law, particularly in the general sports sector, where we're asking whether there should be age restrictions on Rowan's Law. Certainly, Rowan's Law will apply to the entire elementary, secondary system, but all of the states have concussion protocols. Many of them specify that the age cutoff is 18, 19, 20. We know that the brain research shows that the brain is continuing to develop till 25. Should Rowan's Law apply to individuals up to age 25, up to age 18, or should should we have it wide open so that it applies to all competitive amateur athletes? So those are the kinds of questions that we're asking. There's a link to our concussion consultation paper. I would ask you, if you're interested in going on to the website, it's only going to be up until Monday. There is an election coming up, and as such, we'll, as a ministry, we will no longer be in a position to be seeking advice publicly. So if you're interested in responding, and we would really appreciate your response, and the responses that we get to the survey really will form the basis of how we move forward with the specificity of the regulations. I will just say that, just in closing, that we are not only working on the regulations, the legislation of Rowan's Law, but we're also working on those other recommendations, some of which were discussed today, recommendations like a coach's toolkit, recommendations like sharing of information. Some of those recommendations relate to all the ministries, and we're working together to ensure harmonization, and we'll be working and reaching out to stakeholders in the next few months. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, thank you. Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I think we owe these gentlemen here a round of applause. What a fantastic presentation. I can't even put in words, Gordon, how I feel. So congratulations on doing that. That was fantastic. So I appreciate your honesty and your straightforwardness. That concludes the sessions for today. In a minute, I'm going to ask Warren Hoshizaki to come forward. He talked a little bit about privet. We're going to have if you want to stay for that, Warren will be leading that in just a few minutes. I just wanted to give you a few notes. Before I do that, I'd like to remind you that tomorrow's session starts at 9 a.m. sharp with Dr. Rabrakantu and the Boston University School of Medicine. Very exciting speaker. You won't want to miss him at 9 o'clock. Joining Dr. Cantu tomorrow will be Dr. Scott Delaney. I think he was referred to as stone hands today, once or twice. I think he may be here actually too, listening. Besides being stone hands, Dr. Delaney is Associate Professor and Research Director, Department of Emergency Medicine, McGill University Health Center, and McGill Sports Medicine Clinic. And to conclude our 6th Annual International Concussion Summit will be Haley Wickenheiser. Considered one of the best female hockey players in the world, Haley is a 5-time Olympic medalist and 7-time World Championship medalist. Her Olympic career spans 5 Winter Olympics between 1998 and 2014, earning a silver medal and 4 gold medals. Well, I'll see you tomorrow at 9. Stay tuned for Warren now and Privet. Thank you very much for being here.
Yes. Yeah, I think somebody gave Kathleen the...
Yep. You're on. You're going to be perfect. No problem. Some of them are staying for it, so you're really
Perfect,
good.
awesome.
No, really
Well,
good.
thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Great. Do you want me to?
He said that there was a little cue card
Right.
or something to. Okay.
To
I
change
guess
your-
just press the green arrow.
Just press the
to
green.
Move forward. Oh, I guess I can see everything right here.
Oh yeah, you can see it right there. You ready to go?
For sure. Yeah.
Okay, let's go. We have a presentation here, and as I promised, Darcy, are you still here? Okay, I want to introduce Privet, Russell.
Russell Goodwin, yeah.
Russell Goodwin from Pivot.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Russell Goodwin. I'm representing a company called Privet. We're a London, Ontario-based service as a software company that is working with sporting organizations, colleges, universities, as well as Ontario school boards to help distribute, collect, and manage any sort of preseason health information or required information as part of registration in sports. So back in 2015, we collaborated with OFIA to help create an online system for school boards to distribute OFIA's safety standard guidelines. And we piloted this within the Thames Valley District School Board and the London District Catholic School Board back in 2015, particularly in secondary schools, to sort of get a feel for how this information can be properly managed. So one of the things that we did while building out the solution is that we configured the platform to help meet the required recommendations that came out as a result of Rowan's Law. But aside from the concussion information, we also help address anything dealing with Sabrina's Law and Ryan's Law as well as PPM 161, which I don't know if anybody's aware of, but it's another piece of legislation that's coming down from the Ministry of Education to help work with giving schools better ideas on how to deal with prevalent